The radar operators at Forward Operating Base Granite had seen sandstorms before, but this one had come from nowhere, a wall of red dust that swallowed the Afghan sky like a living thing. Captain Reyes stood in the operations center watching the screens flicker and die, one by one, as the static consumed everything. They had 6 aircraft in the air. Now they had nothing but white noise and prayer. Last known position, Colonel Haverson's voice cut through the chaos. Grid November 7-4, sir, but that was 8 minutes ago. 8 minutes was an eternity. The storm had rolled in from the east, meteorology had missed it completely, and now somewhere in that churning darkness were 2 F-16s, 3 Apache helicopters, and 1 A-10 Thunderbolt II. The Warthog. The plane everyone said was too slow, too ugly, too stubborn to quit flying even though newer aircraft had tried to replace it for decades. The pilot of that A-10 was Captain Nadia Revenant Volkov, and she had a reputation that preceded her like a shadow. Quiet, competent, unshakable. She'd flown combat missions in 3 different theaters, accumulated more flight hours than pilots twice her age, and never once raised her voice on comms. Some of the younger aviators called her the ghost. Others whispered she was cold, mechanical, that she cared more about the aircraft than the people inside it. What they didn't know, what Reyes knew because he'd read her file during a sleepless night last month, was that Revenant had been the only survivor of a mid-air collision during a training exercise 7 years ago. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Kine, had died on impact. The investigation cleared her. The guilt never did. "Sir, we're getting something." The radar operator leaned forward, his face bathed in green light. "Intermittent contact, low altitude, bearing 270. Intermittent. It's there, then it's not. Could be atmospheric interference." Haverson's jaw tightened. Or it could be someone flying nap of the Earth through a sandstorm, because they've lost all nav equipment and they're trying to find home by sheer willpower. The room fell silent. Flying that low in zero visibility was suicide. The terrain was unforgiving, jagged peaks and sudden valleys that had claimed aircraft before. No one flew like that unless every other option had already killed them. "Get me a visual," Haverson ordered. "I want eyes on that contact." But Reyes was already staring at the screen, at the faint blip that appeared and vanished like a heartbeat, and he was thinking about the call sign Revenant. A revenant was something that returned from the dead, something that refused to stay buried. Outside, the storm began to scream. The A-10 had always been an ugly aircraft, built around a cannon so powerful that firing it could slow the plane mid-air. Pilots joked it was less a jet and more a flying gun with delusions of grandeur. But in the hands of someone like Volkov, ugly became beautiful in the way that brutal honesty was beautiful, stripped of pretense, undeniable in purpose. She'd lost her instruments 12 minutes into the storm. The heads-up display had gone first, then the multifunction displays, then even the backup compass that was supposed to survive a nuclear blast. What remained was her, the stick, the throttle, and 32 years of instinct screaming at her to stay alive. The turbulence threw the aircraft sideways. She corrected without thinking, muscles responding before her mind could catch up. Outside the canopy, the world was the color of rust and rage, a howling nothing that erased horizon and sky and ground into one undifferentiated void. She was flying on feel alone, reading the aircraft's movements like a language written in violence. Her radio was dead. No GPS, no ground communication, no way to tell anyone she was still breathing. For all they knew at Granite, she'd already augured into a mountainside and was burning somewhere in the hills. The thought didn't frighten her. Fear required imagination, and imagination was a luxury she'd abandoned 7 years ago in the wreckage of her friend's aircraft. Instead, she focused on the sound of the engines. The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans were still producing thrust, still fighting against the wind that wanted to drag her from the sky. She'd flown this aircraft, tail number 80247. She knew every rivet and patch for 3 Tour. She knew when the starboard engine was running 2% hotter than specs. Knew the slight drift to port that maintenance could never fully correct. Knew it like she knew her own heartbeat. Below her, the ground was rising. She felt it more than saw it, a pressure change, an instinctive wrongness. She pulled back on the stick, climbing blind, and felt the belly of the aircraft miss something solid by what could only have been meters. "Come on, girl," she whispered to the plane. "Stay with me." The A-10 shuddered, groaned, and obeyed. They climbed together through the screaming dark, pilot and machine bound by something deeper than mechanics, more primal than engineering. Trust, maybe, or desperation. In a storm like this, they were the same thing. She checked her fuel gauge by feel, fingers finding the dial in the darkness. 20 minutes, maybe less. Then she'd be gliding, and gliding in a sandstorm was just falling with extra steps. At Granite, the operations center had become a cathedral of tension. Nobody spoke unless they had to. The radar showed nothing useful, just the ghost of a contact that appeared every 30 seconds like a pulse from somewhere beyond the storm. Rescue teams were grounded. Medevac was grounded. Even the rescue helicopters, built to fly in hell itself, were sitting on the tarmac with their rotors tied down against the wind. Captain Reyes stood beside Colonel Haverson, both men staring at the same screen, willing it to show them something they could act on. Behind them, Lieutenant Shaw, young, fresh from flight school, still carrying the idealism that combat missions would beat out of him eventually, spoke the question everyone was thinking. "Why don't we hear from the others? The F-16s, the Apache." "The 16s would have punched out," Haverson said quietly. "Modern ejection systems, they'll survive. The Apache would have set down when they lost visibility. Emergency landing protocols. They'll be damaged, maybe, but the crews know what they're doing." "And the A-10?" Haverson didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been grief. "The A-10 doesn't have the luxury of choice. Too low, too slow. Ejecting at that altitude in a storm, you're a meat projectile looking for a rock to hit. Setting down, not in that terrain, not without visibility. So you keep flying. You fly until you can't anymore." "That's insane." "That's revenant." Shaw blinked, "Sir. Captain Volkov earned that call sign because she doesn't know how to quit. 7 years ago, she should have died with her wingman. Everyone said so. The G-forces alone should have turned her brain into soup. But she walked away from that wreck, and the first thing she did, the very first thing, was file a request to get back in the cockpit." Reyes remembered reading that detail in her file. The psychiatrist had recommended 6 months of grounding. She'd been flying again in 6 weeks. "She's either the best pilot we have," Haverson continued, "or she's trying to finish what that collision started. Either way, if anyone's crawling out of that storm, it's her." The radar blipped. "They're gone there." "Closer." Volkov's hands were cramping. She'd been gripping the stick for nearly 20 minutes with the kind of tension that turned muscles to stone, fighting the aircraft and the storm in a battle neither could truly win. Sweat ran down her spine despite the cold. Her flight suit was soaked through. The fuel gauge needle was kissing empty. She tried everything. Circling, hopping to find a break in the storm. Climbing, thinking altitude might give her a way out. Nothing worked. The sandstorm was enormous, maybe 40 kilometers across, and she was somewhere in the middle of it with no instruments and no idea which way was home. For the first time in 7 years, she let herself think about Marcus. They'd been flying in formation, routine training exercise over Nevada, blue skis and perfect conditions. Then his aircraft had experienced a catastrophic hydraulic failure. No warning, no time to react. His jet had yawed hard left directly into her flight path. She tried to dive, he tried to climb, and physics had made the decision for both of them. The collision had torn her aircraft apart. She remembered the sound, metal screaming, systems dying, the sudden cold rush of wind as the canopy blew. She remembered pulling the ejection handle, remembered the brutal acceleration of the rocket motor firing, remembered hitting the ground hard enough to crack 2 ribs and fracture her wrist. She didn't remember Marcus's aircraft auguring into the desert floor 3 seconds after impact. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the dead radio. Not to Marcus. Apologies couldn't reach the dead. To the people at Granite who were watching their screens, waiting for her to fail, waiting for confirmation that another pilot had been swallowed by their own mistakes. Then the turbulence smoothed out, just a little, just enough. Volkov's eyes snapped forward. The violence of the air had changed texture, less chaotic, more directional. She banked slightly, following the flow, and felt the aircraft respond with something that might have been eagerness. Wind had patterns, storms had structure, if she could read it. There, a break in the darkness, barely visible. Not clear sky, but thinner dust, a gradient from rust to amber. She pointed the nose toward hope and pushed the throttle forward, burning fuel she didn't have to chase a maybe that might not exist. Contact bearing 265, altitude 200 feet, closure rate 90 knots. The radar operator's voice had gone tight with controlled panic. "Sir, whatever that is, it's coming straight at us." Haverson grabbed the radio. "All stations, this is Granite Actual. We have an unidentified aircraft inbound from the storm. I want eyes on that contact now." Outside, the sandstorm's leading edge was finally starting to break up. The wall of dust that had seemed infinite was thinning, showing patches of gray sky beyond. Visibility was still terrible, maybe 300 meters, but it was better than nothing. On the tarmac, ground crews were already moving, securing equipment, clearing the runway. Rescue teams stood ready even though there was nothing yet to rescue. They'd been on standby for 23 minutes, hope wearing thinner with every second. Lieutenant Shaw pressed his face nearly against the window, squinting into the settling dust. "I see something. Low, very low, could be debris blown by the wind." "Debris doesn't hold altitude," Ray said. Then they all heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been possible through the storm's dying rage, but somehow was. The distinctive howl of twin turbofan engines pushed to their limits. A scream of defiance that no modern aircraft made because modern aircraft were too refined, too civilized. Only one plane still sounded like that. Only one plane was stubborn enough to fly like that. A-10 Warthog, Haverson breathed. She actually made it. The aircraft emerged from the sandstorm like something being born, covered in dust, one wing dipping lower than the other, trailing faint wisps of hydraulic fluid that caught the light like tears. The landing gear was already down, and Volkov was lining up on the runway with the kind of precision that spoke to thousands of hours and zero room for error. She was too low, approaching too fast. The crosswind was still gusting at 30 knots. "She's not going to make it," Shaw said. "Yes, she is," Reyes replied, and he believed it with something that transcended logic. The A-10 dropped toward the runway like a falling anvil, the kind of approach that would make any sane pilot abort and go around. But going around meant fuel, and fuel was something Revenant didn't have. This was the landing or it was the crash. Binary. Absolute. 300 meters, 200, 100. The wheels touched asphalt. The landing was violent in the way that survival was violent, brutal, inelegant, and absolutely final. The main gear hit hard enough to compress the shock struts completely. The aircraft bounced, slammed down again, and Volkov stood on the brakes with everything she had left. Smoke poured from the tires. The nose gear screamed. The A-10 slewed sideways, fighting her for control even in these last seconds, but she'd been fighting it for 27 minutes and she was done losing. The aircraft shuddered to a halt 30 meters from the end of the runway. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then the canopy opened with a hydraulic wheeze and Volkov climbed out. Her legs nearly failed her. She grabbed the side of the cockpit, steadied herself, and dropped to the tarmac with the grace of someone who'd forgotten how bodies were supposed to work. Ground crew was already running toward her, medics and firefighters and officers, but she waved them off with a gesture that brooked no argument. She walked around her aircraft slowly, methodically, checking for damage. The leading edges of the wings were scoured nearly smooth by sand. The paint was stripped in patches. One of the stabilators had a crack running through it that would require complete replacement. The starboard engine housing was dented where something, debris, maybe, or a bird that had been as lost as she was, had impacted at speed. But the aircraft was whole, damaged certainly, beaten definitely, but whole. Captain Reyes reached her first medical team in tow. "Captain Volkov, we need to check you for." "I'm fine." Her voice was hoarse from breathing through clenched teeth for half an hour. "The aircraft needs attention before I do." "The aircraft is replaceable, you're not." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Reyes saw something in her eyes that made him step back. Not anger, not fear, something colder and more permanent. Acceptance, maybe. The kind that came from knowing exactly how close death had been and deciding it wasn't close enough. "Everything's replaceable, Captain, even me, especially me." She turned back to her aircraft, running her hand along the battered fuselage. "She got me home, that's what matters." "What happened up there?" "Lost instruments, lost comms, lost nav, flew by feel and got lucky." "That wasn't luck," Reyes said quietly. "That was skill." Volkov didn't respond. She was staring at something on the nose of the aircraft, where the dust had settled in patterns that almost looked like words. Or maybe she was just staring, seeing something none of them could see, replaying the flight in her mind to find the mistakes she'd made and catalog them for next time. The debriefing happened 3 hours later, after Volkov had been cleared by medical. Mild dehydration, muscle strain, no permanent damage, and had filed the preliminary incident report with her characteristic efficiency. The room was too bright and too small, and Colonel Haverson sat across from her with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. "Walk me through it again, from the moment you lost instruments." Volkov's voice was flat, professional, empty of the emotion that still churned somewhere beneath her ribs. 13 minutes into patrol, the storm hit faster than meteorology predicted. Visibility dropped to 0. HUD failed, then the MFDs, then backup systems. Standard protocols would have been to climb above the storm, but the ceiling was too low and too violent. Descending risked controlled flight into terrain. So I maintained altitude and bearing, based on last known position, and dead reckoning. Dead reckoning through a sandstorm with no instruments. "Yes, sir." "For 27 minutes. 29, sir. The last 2 were approach and landing." Haverson leaned back, studying her. "The other pilots, the F-16s ejected safely. They're already recovered. The Apache crews set down in valleys and waited it out. Standard procedure, good decisions all around. But you," he paused, "you flew through it." "The A-10 doesn't eject well at low altitude." Setting down.